Welcome to this lecture series on ethics. This is lecture number 9 and we are going to concentrate on ethics in modern period and particularly the social contract model of Thomas Hobbes. So, to understand the development of ethics, the evolution and development of ethics, we also need to understand the historical context in which certain theories and certain ideas have emerged. This will be particularly visible when we try to understand the emergence of ethics in modern period, because we are now reaching a period where after the Greek era and then after the medieval Christian era, we are now going to understand certain other perspectives in ethical theory and in ethics in general. So, we have seen the eudaimonistic perspectives of the Greeks, then a kind of divine theories, the ethical theories or moral perspectives rooted in the idea of divine, idea of God in the medieval period. And now with the modern period, there are certain very important historical developments, particularly the Reformation, the scientific revolution and various other things that have happened during this age. And naturally, these historical and social developments have influenced thinkers, ethicists and the development of moral theory in a certain way in Europe. So, we are going to address some of these things, and one very important theoretical perspective is social contract theory. So, here we will try to see a modern era that has evolved as a result of the cultural, social and political changes, which we call as enlightenment a little later, and also try to see how certain very important doctrines have evolved during this era. And now economic changes also have played a very important role, because there was expansion of trade and the establishment of new industrial houses, novel technologies were developed for production. All these things have definitely have greater influence on the ethical perspectives of people. And invention of printing, of course, was very important, and Copernican revolution and Galileo's inauguration of a new science that employs empirical method and mathematical tools. All these things were very important developments that have taken during this era, and Protestant Reformation. Our discussion of modern ethics will start with some contributions of Thomas Hobbes. And here we will, like many other modern philosophers, Hobbes is also concerned about human nature and tries to root his entire philosophical thinking in his understanding of human nature. So, Hobbes's conception of human nature is very interesting. He very famously proclaimed that man is fundamentally nasty, brutish and selfish. It will be very interesting to see what kind of morality he develops from this kind of a view, this overview of human nature. Hence, morality, naturally, if man is fundamentally nasty, brutish and selfish, morality cannot be so natural. So, then what is morality? He says that human self-interest and the desire for self-preservation demand us to avoid the basic natural state. He describes the state of nature or the natural state in terms of fundamental human nature, nasty, brutish and selfish, and self-interest dominates. But what will happen if self-interest dominates? If every human being is solely concerned about his or her self-interest, this can lead to certain consequences. So, he says that there is a concern, there is a deeper concerns and more important concern for self-preservation. This demands us to avoid the basic natural state and to arrive at what he calls the establishment of civil societies, to seek a state of peaceful coexistence, where other people are also accommodated into our world. And morality, politics, society and commodious living are all purely conventional for Thomas Hobbes. So, because of this fundamental human nature, which he understands in terms of self-interest and self-preservation. So, it is in this context we have to start our understanding of Hobbes' conception of morality. He says that there is nothing absolutely or objectively good or evil, as many other philosophers who would have construed, who would have thought that there is something fundamentally called good and fundamentally called evil. See, for instance, the divine command theory would argue that what is good is absolutely good. That is good because God has proclaimed it to be so. So, there is a reason, there is an extra-worldly reason for something to be, for being good. There is a deeper significance for understanding, but in Thomas Hobbes' view, there is nothing which is absolutely and objectively good or evil. Good or evil are based on our appetites and desires. So, there is a way in which our subjective, our individual mind, our individual considerations are linked with what is good and evil. So, there is a subjectivity involved in it, hence as a result. So, good or evil are based on our appetite and desire. What satisfies our desire is to be treated as good, and what is against our desire is to be understood as evil. And the basis of all human action is to obtain those things that we consider as good, which are nothing but what we desire to attain. So, our desire would decide what is good for us, and we pursue. There is a natural right in us to pursue that. Every human being has a natural right to pursue what he thinks, what he desires, what he thinks is right and what he thinks is good for him. But there are certain issues with this. That is why his conception of morality is problematic and also interesting. Now, again, when we try to understand Hobbes' theory of human nature, we could see the influence of the scientific revolution and the discoveries of universal laws of nature in developing his theory of human nature. These scientific theories were just emerging during this period, 17th century and all that, and that was a time when Europe was gradually shifting from a feudalistic economy towards a market economy, with the development and establishment of new factories and industrial houses, and also the expansion of trade to different parts of the world, colonization and various other socio-political development. And in that sense, we can say that Hobbes' psychological theory is nothing but it is an offshoot of the mechanistic worldview which he was influenced by, that everything in this universe is produced by matter and motion. The matter in motion, this was the dominant mechanistic view that was prevalent during those days of modern Europe. Our actions and choices can be explained in terms of universal laws of nature. So, there is nothing more significant than what is there in the physical world and its rules, according to Hobbes. So, we do not have to search for anything which is more substantially valuable and which makes things ethical, makes things moral, which makes things good or evil. What is it then? It is nothing but our desires, which can be understood purely in terms of applying the scientific principles, the rules of nature. So, here we can see how the moral words which conventional moralist, ethicist would be employing can be translated into individual taste or preferences. See, for example, loving. Love is treated as a greater value within the Christian tradition and many other traditions. Love is treated as a highly regarded, it is regarded as a valuable moral asset by many ethical frameworks. But Thomas Hobbes would say that love needs to be understood as things we are drawn towards. There is love because we are drawn towards that. So, it is purely something to do with us individually, and different individuals might be driven towards different things. Again, hatred, there is nothing which is in an object which makes it intrinsically what you call objectionable, so that we should hate it, but it is nothing but we are repelled by. And good is nothing by, it is described in terms of our appetites, and evil can be described in terms of aversions towards something. So, there is nothing objectively and absolutely true about these words. Certain state of affairs in this world, in this universe, that would make them good or evil in the absolute sense of the term, but only our attitude towards them, our approaches towards them. And here one very important concept which Hobbes' framework, to understand Hobbes' ethical framework, we need to understand his concept of state of nature, which is a very important notion in his framework. It is termed as a state of utter distrust. The state of nature is understood as a state of utter distrust, a state of perpetual and unavoidable war, because as I mentioned earlier, he treats man by nature as nasty and brutish and selfish. Every man would be pursuing his or her self-interest. So, naturally such a state would definitely will be a state of perpetual and unavoidable war, because every individual might be pursuing his or her self-interest, which might contradict with each other's, and naturally this might result in a kind of a conflict and war and chaos. So, the life of a man in its natural state is in a condition of war and is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. So, this is a very unfortunate situation, and this is a state of utter distress. We all have to put up with this, but we can't put up with such a situation. We need to overcome it. There is reason why we need to overcome this, because we are reasonable as well. We are not animals. Human beings are not animals. Since we are reasonable, we can overcome this perpetual state of uncertainty and unavoidable war and utter distrust, and probably arrive at a better situation where we can live a better life, a more peaceful and happier life. So, how can we do that? That is the pursuit, that is where morality comes into picture. Men are naturally and exclusively self-interested, they are more or less equal to one another. All these aspects, all these factors would make the situation worse. No long term or complex cooperation can be expected from men. If this is the case, if state of nature is what is the fact, if that alone is the fact, if that alone is reality, then we cannot expect any cooperation, we cannot expect any peaceful coexistence. Every person is always in fear of losing his life to another, and they have no capacity to ensure the long term satisfaction of their needs or desires, because I have the right to do that. My state of nature assures that or ensures that I have the right to pursue my self interest, my desire, but I cannot do that, unfortunately. I need the help of other people, the cooperation of other people to satisfy my desires and needs. What should I do for that? I cannot expect that other people would listen to me, and they would cooperate with me and help me for attaining my goals, my desires, unless I too do that same for them. I too have to help them and cooperate with them, so that they can also attain their goals and satisfy their desires. So, we need to arrive at a win-win situation where both of us, both me and other people with whom I have to interact with, I am forced to interact with, will have to arrive at a kind of a cooperative situation, a kind of a contract, and it is from this necessity the idea of social contract has evolved. State of nature is the worst possible situation in which men can find themselves. So, this is a worse situation, very unfortunate situation, which can lead to total destruction of humankind. But there is something which gives us hope. As far as human nature is concerned, Hobbes says that there are at least 3 factors which we need to understand, which constitute human nature. The first one is its mechanistic nature or its mechanistic aspect. The second one is its self-interestedness. Every human being is self-interested. So, these 2 aspects we have already explained, but there is something else, something more than that, that is we are reasonable. Human beings are reasonable creatures, and this rationality in us enable us to pursue a long lasting peace and sustainability in our peaceful state of affair. So, all men pursue only what their own individual best interest. Men are mechanistically drawn to that which they desire and repelled by that to which they averse. Everything we do is motivated solely by the desire to better our own situation and satisfy our desires. These are all aspects which naturally emanate from our fundamental nature, which is rooted in self interest. That is true, but at the same time we are also reasonable. Men have the rational capacity to pursue their desires as efficiently and maximally as possible. Every creature has the ability to pursue their desires, but men can do that efficiently and maximally as possible. So, this is where the rational aspect plays a very key role. Rationality is purely instrumental. It enables us to understand situation by evaluating, by taking into account of complexities of the situation in which it is involved. We can add, subtract and compare and see what is the best outcome. So, this is where rationality plays, the capacity to formulate the best means to whatever ends we might happen to have, something which we can attain. What is that? The happiest, the satisfaction, the reasonable satisfaction of our desires can be attained by entering into a contract. Reason salvages us from the perpetual state of distrust. How do we do that? Reason enables us to see the laws of nature that help us to escape the state of nature and create a civil society. So, this is very essential. So, it is in this sense, you can see how from human nature he starts with his ideas of human nature, and from there he takes us to a situation, or he rather tells us how, if followed the state of nature, how men can end up in total chaos or total disorder and total distrust, where nothing is achievable, no civilization is achievable, no higher goals will be achievable, everybody will be a loser. But from this state we can go to the next stage, where we can reasonably attain our goals, achieve our desires, satisfy our desires by developing, by creating a civil society with other people. So, the construction of a civil society, the establishment of a civil society would help us to escape from the state of nature. Each man be willing to pursue peace when others are willing to do the same, because these are all universal facts that every man seeks peace, every man wants peace, every man wants the satisfaction of his or her desires, and this is possible only by satisfying one's desires one can be peaceful. And since every human being desires to have peace, which is possible only by establishing a civil society with the cooperation and help and assistance of other people, then each man will be willing to pursue peace with others. Also retains the right, at the same time since it is rational, we also retain the right to continue to pursue war when others do not pursue peace. So, there is a possibility that this peace might break down at any moment, and the moment it breaks down, contract also will break down. So, contract is a purely conventional thing, it is nothing absolute in it. Contract, construct a social contract that will save man from the uncertainties of the state of nature. So, social contract becomes the central principle notion of Hobbesian political theory. So, we have arrived at, from his conception of human nature, we have arrived at an understanding of his ethics, and from there now we are gradually moving towards an understanding of Hobbes' political theory, which is rooted in the concept of a social contract. In the state of nature gives rights to people against one another in pursuing their interest. Reason makes them to agree to collectively and reciprocally renounce these rights to establish a civil society. So, every human being will have to renounce some of their rights in order to construct, establish a civil society and also authorize. That is a very important point. This one is a very important point. The first one is the nature of state. Second one is how reason enables or reason tells us that it is very important to renounce our rights, and the third one is what will you do after that and how do you do this? Authorize a person, some person or an assembly of persons to enforce the initial contract. So, the contract has already been set, but now you need a principle of sovereign, a sovereign authority to oversee this, to enforce the initial contract and choose to submit to the authority of this sovereign. So, reason also demands us all human beings to renounce a greater part of our rights and submit ourselves to a very great extent unconditionally to the sovereign, to the authority of the sovereign. The civil society is conducive to their own interest. And now, let us see some the historical backdrop. As I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, there is no ethical theory, no political theory, no social theory is free from the historical and political changes that take place. Similarly, Hobbes, the social contract theory is also developed in a very unique social, political and economic context. For that, we have to understand the England in 17th century England in 1620s. It was emerging as a market economy that demanded the displacement of feudalism and aristocracy and recognizing the rights of citizens, because in a certain way the very concept, the very idea of market economy functions more efficiently and effectively with the recognition of individual rights. So, that becomes very important. And English Civil War, it was in this context the Civil War broke out between the king and his supporters, who are the monarchists, and the parliamentarians. The Civil War, which lasted several years from 1642 to 1648, and Hobbes was not actually taking any side. Hobbes was not saying that the king, the monarchists are right or the other people are right. Rather, he was trying to propose a middle path, something which he agrees with both of them to some extent, at the same time very carefully and very importantly distances himself from the perspectives of both these opposing parties. What he says is that he rejects the theory of the divine rights of king. This is what the monarchists were highlighting, the divine rights of king. The king is the representative of God in this earth, and the authority of the king owes to what God has given. It was bestowed upon the king by God. This is what the theory of the divine rights of kings would advocate. But Hobbes is not ready to accept this view, he rejects it. At the same time, he also had very serious reservations in accepting the idea of sharing power, which the parliamentarians were proposing. They wanted the king to come down and share power with the parliament. So, this was also, Hobbes found that this proposition was also equally problematic, because in his idea the sovereign should be an unconditional authority. It cannot be a sharing authority, it needs to be unconditional authority, supported the idea of power of the sovereign. And the authority of the state, according to him, is absolute. The state has absolute and sovereign authority, and this is essential for all social order. In the absence of such an sovereign power, the state will collapse, the civil society cannot exist, and human beings cannot reasonably attain their satisfaction. To escape the dangers of the state of nature, again, with every man in constant war with every other man, we need a very powerful state at the center who would negotiate every relationship. That we lay down our rights to absolute freedom. For the sake of this, we do that. We contend with so much liberty against other men as he allow other men against himself. So, a kind of equal, first among equals kind of a principle is evolving. Make contracts with each other to this effect, and such contracts are negotiated in the context of the authority, the unconditional authority of the sovereign. Escape from the state of nature. So, this is what Hobbes was proposing to attain. And it is in this context the idea of the Leviathan is introduced. All men will first make a contract with an unconditional power they share, one that holds the sword. This creates the greater Leviathan. This, laying down the power which each individual has in their natural state and creating a Leviathan, making it more and more powerful and attributing it to it all the authority, ascribing to that Leviathan all authority and all power. Leviathan is the mortal god. It is the god on earth to which we owe our peace that is needed for self preservation, because each one of us value our self preservation. For us, that is very important, that is our prime concern, and that concern can be addressed, that can be ensured only if a Leviathan is created, only if a higher authority to which all of us, all human beings, all members of a society would agree to create such a Leviathan, who would negotiate our relationships is created. We transfer our collective strength to it for attaining peace, and social contract with the Leviathan is a source of right and wrong. So, there is nothing called absolutely right and wrong. This is what we have started with. The social contract with the Leviathan is a source of right and wrong, good and evil. Everything is decided on the basis of that. Members of society unconditionally agree to support the social contract. And it is in this context, we would now try to summarize our understanding of Hobbes's moral theory. He proposes a practical morality. Unlike the Greeks, unlike the Greek masters who would argue for a demonistic ethics, or the Indians who would argue for an ethics based on moksha, which is the higher levels of human reality, human experience. Hobbes is proposing a practical morality, which is very interesting, because even after Hobbes, much after him, we would find another very important philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who is a chief proponent of the deontological school. He is coming up with a very different kind of idea. He links his idea of good with duty. I mean, we will discuss that later, but here Hobbes' perspective is very interesting, because he proposes a practical morality. There is no moral absolutism, proposes a practical view. If we want peace, it simply says this: if you want peace, then you ought to contract with a sovereign to protect you from other people. There is a possibility that other people might be a serious threat to your self preservation. That possibility cannot be ruled out, because in the original state of nature, every man is fundamentally nasty and brutish and selfish. So, in that state, we cannot avoid the possibility of death. We cannot avoid the possibility of getting endangered. I mean, we cannot avoid the possibility of getting killed by other human beings. So, this can be prevented only by jointly, collectively, submitting ourselves unconditionally to an external authority. If the sovereign is no longer able to perform the service, we can break the contract. Since everyone wants to avoid death, and therefore, everyone has to contract with a sovereign. So, the moral philosophy ends in his political philosophy and takes a new turn from there. Thomas Hobbes, in that way, is a very interesting philosopher. He is a very important moral perspective, which is rooted in the very idea of social contract, which later on was developed by many other philosophers. Now, social contract theory precisely tells you that the relationship between human beings are based on certain implicit unwritten contract. We all have a fairly good understanding as members of society. Through our process of socializing, we all have a fairly good understanding about this contract, what is expected from us, what others expect from us, and what do we expect from others. It is based on such expectations and such promises and such deliveries we lead a life. And Hobbes' theory is peculiar because he says that to negotiate this relationship, to oversee such relationship, there should be an authority, an overarching authority, an all powerful authority, and that is the Leviathan. So, we will wind up our discussion on Hobbes' philosophy and moral theory here, and next lecture also we will try to address some of the very interesting aspects of social contractarianism, and then move on to the next theoretical perspective. For the time being, we will wind up. Thank you.